Okay, look, I know, please don't comment about it. Yes, I'm wearing a bow. And I think it's very cute. Can you even tell? Is it even visible? Does it clash with the headband? Let me know. So just a quick disclaimer. I am aware that I did get a comment last week requesting me to discuss some questionable comments that came through that I have gone ahead and hidden away just because it was like a lot of dog whistles and just a lot of bullshit. But I did get a request from the original person who commented that made last week's video possible, and they wanted me to talk further about that. I'm going to make that a Patreon exclusive video. You can join my Patreon at patreon.com/narcissistiville. All of my tiers are below $5, so please feel free to donate, help me make this channel dream a possibility, because I do want to talk about it, but I just feel like I'm really trying to focus my content better than I have in the past. At the top of every judging panel of the Boulet Brothers Dragula, the Boulet Brothers offer this disclaimer to their uglies. Drag is art and art is subjective. We are not judging you on your art. We are judging you on your drag and how it fits into this challenge. And this idea, the subjectivity of art, got me thinking about the dichotomy between fan fiction and how it's viewed primarily outside of fandom spaces versus how it tends to be viewed inside of fandom spaces. I would argue that as a genre, fanfiction is not particularly very well respected outside of fandom circles. While there continues to be a growing list of now famous authors who come out as having written fanfiction at some point, it's kind of said in a sort of like self-effacing, self-deprecating way of like, you know, something they did in their misspent youth. I feel like it has this narrative for a lot of people outside of fandom spaces that it's not necessarily something that respectable authors would do or respectable content creators would talk about in anything other than like a joking manner. But let's face it, I'm not what anyone would call respectable, now am I? I'm a trans lesbian with a penchant for drag, butches, and the dramatique. The idea that I write fanfiction currently, actively, and proudly is not something that I think should come as a big shock to anyone. At least not anyone who's been on this channel for any length of time or who happened to stumble upon me through the normal means. Blood sacrifices to an old god or something. I don't know. However you find things on the internet these days. I have to actually apply my makeup while I'm doing this, and it's harder than you'd think. Despite that, this video isn't exactly about my fanfiction. For now, we're gonna specifically talk about fanfiction in general terms. Part 1, the YouTubers. So the first video essay that I ever watched of Lindsay Ellis's was the 2018 Dear Stephanie Meyer 19-minute apology video to the author of the Twilight series. And basically what it gets into is like how Lindsay and a lot of other people, myself included, really gave the Twilight series a lot of shit and the author itself a lot of shit, because we as a society have this habit of hating on anything that is beloved by teenage girls. And I think this is something that really got me thinking about fanfiction, because part of the reason I do think it tends to get shit is that when people are deriding it, a lot of what they're imagining is this cringy online teenage girl writing these like self-insert Mary Sue kidnapping fics. I'm looking at you, Jenny Nicholson. I love her to death. I'm a Patreon subscriber. She's never gonna see this. Why am I even bothering? Anyway, the point is, we have a habit as a society of not liking things that are geared towards young girls and actually women in general, if I'm being honest. You know, makeup continues to get shit, fashion continues to get shit, Barbie continues to get shit. Pretty much anything that girls have ever liked or will ever liked is going to get shit at some point for being too feminine or, you know, any number of stupid things. What I find interesting about this particular video is that obviously Lindsay has grown up, she feels bad about this, and you know, it's so interesting because one of the things it talks about is that it's not just society at large, which is to say, like, men usually who hate things that are primarily geared towards teenage girls. It's also other women and other teenage girls. There's that whole mentality of, I'm not like other girls. I don't like these things that other girls like because that would somehow make me less than. And I honestly have to say, I fell into this trap a lot as a young person. You know, I definitely fell into that whole not liking pink, not liking girly things. I really tried to, for lack of a better term, butch it up. And interestingly, this past year, another YouTuber who I adore, Natalie Wynn, made a video that was 4 hours in length talking about Twilight at large, where she reiterated much the same points that Lindsay had in her video, but also got into the weeds on a bunch of different other stuff, which I found utterly fascinating. Like, honestly, both of those videos are must-watches, in my humble opinion. So look, I'm sure it goes without saying that I was never a Twilight girly. Big shock. Nor would I argue that I'm having any kind of like Twilight renaissance. But as I pointed out earlier, I can't help but notice that part of why Twilight is derided is because it's something that primarily has been enjoyed by women and teenage girls, and we can't have that ever. And what I find so interesting is that there is this idea that fanfiction is much the same way. There is this sort of viewpoint that fanfiction is something that is mostly consumed by and created by teenage girls, and therefore I think even people who once enjoyed fanfiction tend to feel the need to distance themselves from it to give themselves a sort of air of legitimacy. And yet I think anyone who's been in fandom spaces as an adult, I am now almost 33, I've been in fandom spaces for the last 15 years, I can speak to the fact that some of the best stories that I've ever read, some stories that have lasted with me for literally years, are fan fiction. So it doesn't quite drive with this idea that it is something specifically created for or by teenage girls, as if somehow that makes it bad. I do want to clarify my stance on this, that I don't think that something being liked by or made for or even by teenage girls is somehow a bad thing. Drag Race at this point is largely beloved by teenage girls. Trixie Mattel is beloved by teenage girls, and those are by no means anything bad. So, like, let's be clear, I don't think something being created by or liked by teenage girls is a bad thing. What I'm saying is, I do believe that there is this narrative that persists with fanfiction, that it often is not taken seriously, even to this day. And obviously, there's some caveats to that, just like there's going to be caveats to all of these things. And like, look, full disclosure, I understand that there's not all authors who feel this way about fanfiction. I've heard, allegedly, that S.E. Hinton, the author of The Outsiders, who, by the way, I didn't know until recently, was like 14 when she published that, or they published that, I guess. Great for them. That's really cool. Definitely the dream I wanted for my life.
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine.
Anyway, I've heard on the grapevine that they have written fanfiction of their own work, which, not to get too existential, but at a certain point, isn't fanfiction of your own work just like canon? I don't know. I don't want to get too existential. I feel like we could be here all day. It actually just occurred to me that the fact that I've been in fandom spaces for roughly 15 years, like I started my senior year of high school was when I found it. I was literally, I know this sounds like a joke, I was literally 18 by the time I found fanfiction and had ever heard of it. And I remember very distinctly knowing absolutely nothing about fanfiction, to the point I had to Google if gay fanfiction was even a thing, because I had a friend who was reading straight Twilight fanfiction. Or no, maybe it was straight Harry Potter fanfiction. Anyway, not the point. High school, it was a different era. And I was apparently very naive about what fanfiction has pretty much always been. But yeah, it's kind of funny because, like, I really found fanfiction very late, but the realization that I've basically been in fandom spaces for the last 15 years made me feel very old. And, like, I am, I guess, a fandom elder at this point. I mean, obviously there's people who have been in fandom a lot longer, but, like, I don't know. I feel like I'm kind of a fandom elder at this point, and that's a little bit horrifying. I won't lie. Back in my day... I can't help myself. And, like, truth be told, I have been in multiple different fandoms. I feel like I was kind of like a part of a bridge generation when it comes to fanfic, in terms of the fact that, like, I remember fanfiction.net being kind of the primary site that people went to. And I also remember, like, very specific niche fanfiction sites. Technically, AO3 had already been around for like 3 years by the time I discovered fanfiction, but I don't feel like it really kicked off until quite a bit later. I don't know what the exact point is when I remember I first heard about it. I know I first heard about it on Tumblr, and it was probably after I had taken a hiatus from fanfiction for a little bit. And I think after I came back, that's when Archive of Our Own had really kicked off. At least that's when I remember hearing about it for the first time. I want to say that was maybe like 2018. And, like, for the record, even though I've been reading fanfiction since 2010, I've only actually been writing it since 2018. Actually, in making this video, I did remember that I did have a brief foray of attempting to write fanfiction sometime in the early 2010s. I believe that was back when I was in the Glee fandom, but that's like an embarrassing foray, and it was not as well received. It was not until 2018 and finding Archive of Our Own that I really started writing fanfiction regularly and found a actual audience with fanfiction. I joke a lot about the first fandom that I was in, calling it Fandom Redacted, and it's not because I'm necessarily embarrassed by what I've written or anything like that. It's because the author's a fucking turf. So I, needless to say, fell out of the fandom pretty much after everything with that came to a head. I ended up losing quite a bit of fandom friends that I had made after I, like, started divorcing myself from that fandom and embracing my lesbian identity. And started embracing my... God, what was... Oh, okay. And started embracing my more lesbian identity. I'm not gonna say that I think it was like lesbophobia, although I definitely did experience that in the fandom. I did make a whole YouTube video talking about fandom's issue with sapphic ships and how they don't tend to get the same attention. And I will say part of my frustration and part of what made me feel like I was being ostracized from this community that had once upon a time accepted me was the fact that I was trying to, you know, trans these characters as a sort of FU to the author. I was trying to make them sapphic, again, as like this FU to this author. And my readership just went down. Everything else remained equal, but people just didn't seem interested in what I had to say anymore. And that became very discouraging. All of that, plus everything that was going on with the author herself, it just felt like it was time to leave this fandom behind once and for all. And I actually left fandom behind in general for a good 3.5 years. After COVID happened, I kind of felt like I just was so exhausted with everything. I really got burnt out. You know, everything was focusing on like my day job, so I really didn't write anything much for most of that 3 years until late July when season 2 of Good Omens came out. By the way, I was making a lot of content about Fandom Redacted at a certain point in my YouTube career, and for a long time I've unlisted that because it's not something I want on my channel anymore. It's not something that I'm necessarily proud of, but it is something that I did like those essays at the time. I did spend a lot of effort on those essays at the time. So I have decided to put them on my Patreon. Again, if you would like to see my embarrassing past, it is on my Patreon. There's a lot of things that are on my Patreon that aren't just that, but I'm kind of trying to take some of my backlog of content that has just been sitting there and actually do something with it. Just a little more incentive maybe, or disincentive, I guess, depending. I mean, part of the reason that I didn't write almost anything for that 3.5 years also had to do with like IRL friendships that were fizzling out. I was still having some lingering ill health effects. I was still having, not from COVID actually, just dizzy spells that I had all the way back in 2018, and just a lot of like anxiety and depression over the state of the world. Needless to say, I was kind of just burnt out. Also, I'd like to say that if it is actually real, I'd like to have a word with whoever decided that a Saturn return is only 1 year, because I swear to God, mine was 3. It was also preceding COVID, so like, I think anyone who had a Saturn return that preceded COVID deserves a settlement of some sort. I don't know. I don't know from whom, I don't know of what. Maybe the universe, because you're dealing with whatever you're dealing with your Saturn return, and then, oh, boop, everything's shutting down, the world's on fire. Good luck. It's not a great time. It's not a great time, to say the least. And again, I have mixed feelings about whether or not I believe in that. I can't help but feel like about 5 years of my life were like completely fucked from a variety of factors. In fact, I've often said I don't think I really started to live my life until my 30s, which, considering how much anxiety I had about turning 30, is kind of hilarious. It wasn't until July of 2023, the end of July, when Good Omens season 2 came out, that my love of fandom and fanfiction and writing in general came back with a vengeance. Now, I will say Fandom Redacted was by no means the only fandom I was in, though it was the first I consider. Interestingly, there was a period where I did fall out of Fandom Redacted and ended up heavily moving into the Glee fandom instead. Does that track at all that I was a part of the Glee fandom? I'm sure it does. Then I was later a part of the Supernatural fandom, first as a D-Steel shipper, and then as a Sastiel shipper. That's right, I changed brothers. Come at me. I feel like that's gonna be the thing that gets people up in arms. I even had a period around 2012 after I saw The Avengers. I was dragged against my will, I will say that I ended up getting really into Steve and Tony fanfiction. And around the same time, I also saw Skyfall, again, kind of against my will, and ended up really getting into James Bond and his Quartermaster fanfiction. I definitely do not seem like I would be a part of those fandoms, but what are you gonna do? Here we are. Despite the fact that I never actually read the Twilight books, and I've only seen some of the movies against my will, I did have a period where I did unironically read Jasper and Edward fanfiction, so I can also count that as like a fandom that I've kind of been a part of. I don't remember anything about those fics, like nothing about them stands out to me, but it is something that I can say that I did. So as I kind of alluded to, there was a period where I fell out of Fandom Redacted, but the truth of the matter is, like, as much as I hate to admit it, I'm not even sure that I would be a writer if not for that book. But not for the reason that you might think. So, funny story, when I was like 11 years old, I remember very distinctly my Aunt Kim. Hi, Kim. She's not watching this video either. Oh God, no one in my family is watching these videos. Anyway, I remember her having a conversation with my other aunt, Redacted, in which my Aunt Kim said that she wished she had written that series so that she could have made all that money. And my 11-year-old brain said, I could do that. And then I took it way too far, and here we are. I don't think I've ever told that story before. Anyway, read my book Assassin of Witches, link in bio. No reason or relation to that story. I'm leaving that in. I don't know if you caught that, but my cat decided he wanted to jump onto my stomach while I was attempting to do my makeup, so I didn't have a free hand to catch him. So he nearly tore my stomach open. It's fine. I was gonna say that has no relation to the story or anything. And like, here's the thing, despite how everything ended with that fandom and just everything with the author in general, there's still stories that I read in there that kind of just live in my brain. And as much as I try to purge them, I just can't. And that's kind of the thing about fandom in general. As I said, there are so many fanfics that just live inside your brain no matter what you do. They're just there and they're a part of you. And so I find that dichotomy of this idea of like fanfiction as this thing that's not actually serious and not actually good. I find it so interesting because it's just not the reality that I've ever experienced in reading fanfiction. The history of fanfiction. So like I said, there's this kind of ahistorical idea that like fanfiction is this new thing that's like very created by teenagers and is just, I just find it so fascinating, this idea that we have of fanfiction, and like it's actually just not at all accurate. And it turns out the history of fanfiction is very fascinating. Thank you. Just took 3 takes. So while our modern conception of fanfiction probably dates back to the 1970s and the fanzines for Kirk and Spock fanfiction of Star Trek, technically fanfiction by any other name has existed a lot longer than even that. Take a book like John Milton's Paradise Lost, which is essentially biblical fanfiction, which I would argue is probably one of the biggest types of fanfiction out there. The Bible is fanfiction of itself, but that's not the point. Which is a novel that is partly a story of Adam and Eve and partly the story of Lucifer/Satan and how he fell along with the other angels. And frankly, it's about as much fanfiction as anything else you can find today, and it is definitely influenced a lot of literature of our current understandings of things like Adam and Eve, the fall, and hell. Even something like Dante's Inferno, which again would be argued by many to be biblical fanfiction, has definitely influenced how we view the hell and the idea of the rings of hell and all of that. In fact, that's something that largely inspires something like Hell of a Boss or Has Been Hotel. Or you might consider something like Sherlock Holmes or even Grimm's fairy tales, which are considered public domain but have been remade about 1,000 different times. I would argue that that gets into fanfiction territory, but put a pin in that. So there's this really interesting article by The Atlantic that I found that details fanfiction from the 1700s. Honestly, it's a very fascinating read. I will link it down in the description below. The TLDR is that fanfiction has kind of always been a thing to some degree, and not surprisingly, it was always pretty overtly sexual. No shock there. What has apparently always been the case is that there's been a sort of complicated relationship of fanfic authors and the fanfic writers themselves. Still, I can't help but notice that there is this image that persists of the sort of cringy self-insert Mary Sue online fangirl that's writing all of this fanfiction, despite the fact that that's just not historically the case. But even if it is, so many of these stories are stories that live with you forever and ever and ever, regardless of who's writing them. And I feel like if The Outsiders is anything to go by, we definitely know that younger people can write fiction that becomes so like integrated with the culture that it is something that is required reading in schools. But like, here's the thing, right? I have not been a part of the Glee fandom since I want to say 2012, but there is a fan fiction that I read in that fandom that I still literally to this day think about all the time. Like, it was ongoing at the time that I left the fanfiction back in 2012, but it just stuck with me. Even what I had read, as deeply dark and mysterious and also disturbing in some ways and beautiful in some ways, it just stuck with me. I recently discovered this fanfiction again on AO3, and I did download it, and I've been considering rereading it again and seeing if it still holds up to my memory. Famously, the most well-known, at least in my opinion, Good Omens fanfiction is one that was recommended to me by a friend that is like this novel-length story that follows Crowley and Aziraphale as Crowley is seeking therapy with an American therapist that you might all know as demonology and the triphasic model of trauma. And that's not even the story that I think about when I think about Good Omen stories that have stuck with me and meant a lot to me. And honestly, already in even the Has Been Hotel and Hell of a Boss fandom, I've read many fics that have stuck with me and meant a lot to me. One of the ones that I talk about a lot in my personal life is a fic called Partners, which is like this amazing 600,000 word epic that is still ongoing. It was started back in 2019 when the pilot first came out. And it's magnificent in my humble opinion. And I know there's going to be a lot of fics that other people will probably recommend in the comments of this video in the Has Been fandom, some of which I will have read, some of which I will not have read. I'll leave it to you to decide which is which. I'll never tell. Part 3, queerness in fanfiction. So I don't think that you can actually properly discuss fanfiction without discussing how unapologetically queer it is and how that is integral, I can't say that word right now. That is like so integral to how we view modern fanfiction. As I said, it would be ahistorical to deny that fanfiction has always existed to some degree. It would be disingenuous to ignore the fact that modern fanfiction as we know it today was created primarily for this queer ship. It was created in large part because, especially at the time and for many decades that followed, canon queer ships just weren't a thing. And honestly, I should make a caveat in saying that when I'm talking about the queerness of fanfiction, as much as I would like for it to be otherwise, a lot of the times that queerness is very explicitly a specific type of queerness. Let's face it, I made a video previously during my Fandom Redacted days discussing the sapphic fiction problem that pounds most fandoms. There are some exceptions. Has Been Hotel is actually famously one of them, which makes sense because that primarily has a canonical sapphic ship as like its main crux. But to say that sapphic ships don't often get maligned in other fandoms, and that ships that don't include white, cis-looking men is kind of... I think that would be denying just like a reality of modern ship culture. Whether we like it or not, and it is something that bears discussion, that is something that like I have noticed. And I actually went through like some of the top pairings of the last few decades, and it's pretty embarrassing. When you consider that a lot of the biggest pairings of the last 50 years are traditionally between gay cis men, or at least would appear to be gay cis men who are primarily white, it's hard not to unsee it. I mean, take something like Kirk and Spock, kind of our first original example. Take something like Lestat and Lewis. Take something like Harry and Draco. For better or for worse, let's get into Super Wholock. You have Supernatural of Dean and Castiel. You have Doctor Who. Is there a queer pairing that came with Doctor Who? I've never actually watched it, so I don't actually know. When I saw Super Wholock things, I feel like everyone was just pairing him with Catherine Tate. I don't know who her character was. So like, and then you've got Sherlock and Watson, who are also traditionally queer cis men. And then you have something like Good Omens, which at least on the outside does appear to fall into this same formula. Now, I will grant you that we have known since the books came out that angels technically have no gender. They do have the appearance of these very cisgender, very white men. Now, I know that there are going to be people who are going to argue with me that Crowley is canonically non-binary, and that came out in season 2. That was not information that we had in season 1. But more to the point, I think we have to go based on what things appear as. Now, we have seen changes in the last few years. Obviously, something like What We Do in the Shadows, I think, includes more queer characters of color, or at least the implication. I've never actually watched the show. I don't know if they're canonically queer. I do also know that Our Flag Means Death also includes, canonically queer, but that is kind of the exception that I think only proves the rule in how much it's changed now versus what it's been over the last 50 odd years. And like I said, that queerness is such an integral part to fanfiction's history in the modern sense because it was so often just not seen. Gay men just were not seen in a romantic sense. And even now, I feel like queer characters are just still not as much of a thing as they should be. It is still relegated. It is still kind of niche and uncommon. And I think that's very unfortunate. But at least we're not living in the times that were very much the dark ages of Super Hulock, which not just because of how cringy people were online, but more because of how cringy the actual creators of the show were in pushing this very queerbaiting narrative. And I think I've made a video somewhere on this channel talking about queerbaiting. I know I've talked about the sort of lesbian version of queerbaiting that's specifically for the male gaze, and I think I did a video that was also about queerbaiting in general. And look, while queerness has always been an important part of the actual fandom experience, it's hard not to argue that with all of the queerbaiting and some of the reactions from the creators of the IP themselves, that this might have been a subject of contention for a lot of these creators, especially in the early 2010s. A lot of them didn't seem to like the queering of their stories in general. A lot of them objected to fanfiction whole cloth. And this leads me to a part of this video that I think we also have to talk about when we talk about fanfiction, and it's also not the most fun to discuss. Part 4, copyright. So I don't know that anyone can do a video on fanfiction without discussing copyright and Anne Rice. What can I say about Anne Rice that hasn't already been said by 1,000 other fandom creatives long before me? So let me be clear, despite how I ended that last portion of this video, I'm not necessarily implying that part of Anne Rice's problem with fanfiction was specifically the queerness of it. Obviously, I think it's pretty well documented that a lot of her work was very homoerotic, especially the Vampire Lestat series. But it's hard to deny that her very vehement stand against fanfiction was certainly born of something. So the Daily Beast has a very interesting article that I found specifically discussing Anne Rice and how she kind of changed the game for fanfiction in general and what was and wasn't allowed, and why at the time there was like this really big thing that I remember seeing even as late as 2010, but I even still see sometimes today on Archive of Our Own, which is these copyright disclaimers of people saying, I don't own these works, they are owned by the author, like, please don't sue me. And that is because Anne Rice was known for getting her lawyers involved. Now, it is said that a lot of the story that is passed around now is a little overblown. It was kind of more of a cease and desist thing, but it was definitely enough of an issue that it scared the shit out of people and did kind of destroy the Vampire Lestat fandom space and Anne Rice fanfic space for years to come. In fact, part of the reason Archive of Our Own exists at all is to protect fanfic authors from litigious original creators. According to that Daily Beast article, Anne Rice was quoted as saying on her blog, "I do not allow fanfiction. The characters are copyrighted. It upsets me terribly to even think about fanfiction with my characters. I advise my readers to write your own original stories with your own characters. It is absolutely essential that you respect my wishes." And let's just admit that that is dramatic as fuck. And like I said, apparently those cease and desist letters and the note on her blog were enough to completely annihilate whatever fan base she had in fandom spaces. These days, I would argue most creators are kind of ambivalent at best about fanfiction. There have been some notable examples of like original creators trying to get in on fandom spaces. Honestly, even Stephanie Meyer has been kind of ambivalent at best whenever she's been asked about how she feels about 50 Shades of Grey. It seems clear that she's not exactly comfortable with the overt sexuality of the books, but she seems to take it in stride, and she's been a pretty good sport about it from what I've seen. I remember that for a long time in fandom spaces, and maybe this is just because of what Fandom Redacted was, got a lot of credit as being like one of the great arbiters of change when it came to fanfiction, and the idea that she was part of the reason that fanfiction became more acceptable and that authors started not giving a shit, because her stance was basically, as long as people aren't profiting off of it, she didn't really care. That said, she did have her lawyer send cease and desist letters to the creators of a website back in 2003 that hosted primarily adult fanfiction content, which was, of course, the restricted section. Now, I was introduced to that website all the way back in 2010 when I was first getting into fandom. So, I mean, technically, obviously, it was not stopped by those cease and desist letters, but I do think it's important to note that there is this sort of narrative that her being someone who was kind of vocally okay with fanfiction made it so every author was okay with it, and I just don't think that's the reality of it. Now, this is where I pick up one of my earlier pins, because you'll notice in the Daily Beast article, one of the things that they point out is that fanfiction is kind of in a liminal space. We still like those, right? See, technically, fanfiction falls under fair use, and I would personally argue, this wasn't said in the article, but I would personally argue that a lot of times the way fanfic writers change up the characters and what they're doing and what they're saying, a lot of the times these characters become more your own rather than, you know, an actual representation of the original IP, but that's its own thing. And as I said, there are some creatives that have tried to introduce themselves into these fandom spaces with middling success. Famously, while Neil Gaiman, the co-author of the Good Omens books and the creator of the television show, has said he's okay with fanfiction, he has also explicitly asked not to be included in fanfiction itself, not to be, you know, shown anything, not to have it sent to him. And the reason that's been given is because that would put him into a particularly interesting legal predicament if something he were to read were to end up later coming out in a future installment of the series, which feels like either bullshit or an overabundance of caution. I can't really tell which, but given some information that maybe come out. All that said, I mean, it's undeniable that copyright is kind of a complicated and messy thing that is often used by large corporations to silence a smaller brand. In fact, one of the reasons I stopped making video essays a while ago about fandom-related content is because it kept getting copyright struck, despite the fact that I was using the clips in fair use. And the fact is, considering that my channel is relatively small, and at the time it was even smaller, something like that can considerably hurt my channel and how much it's allowed to be seen. And even if I try to dispute it with YouTube that it does technically fall under fair use, more often than not, I get met with just being ignored or the copyright is held up anyway. And the thing is, as Jenny Nicholson recently pointed out in an interview when she discussed the fact that her video about the Galactic Star Cruiser was copyright claimed by Disney, it is the sort of thing that for her channel, because she doesn't necessarily depend on AdSense dollars, that's not going to hurt her bottom line all that much. But with someone like me, who is still working up to get enough AdSense dollars to actually get a check from YouTube, every little bit counts. And look, I don't think that it can be overstated that the modern copyright system is the mangled mess that it is, largely because of the Walt Disney Company. Despite the fact that some of their most popular IPs of the last ever have always been of these public domain properties. Honestly, I could go on an entire rant about how public domain is essentially fan fiction and copyright is absolutely a scam. And as far as I'm concerned, even a moderately large fan fiction author, if they were allowed to monetize their content, isn't going to significantly cut into the sales of the original IP. And more than likely, they're also not going to confuse anyone who's looking for that IP anyway. Nobody who's reading Good Omens fanfiction is reading it under the assumption that it's the actual novel that came out 30 years ago. Nobody who's reading Hazbin Hotel fanfiction is reading it under the assumption that it is the original IP. Like, I just don't buy this idea that it would somehow tarnish the intellectual property that much for fanfiction authors to be able to make money when fan artists are allowed to make money off of their work. And don't get me wrong, I think that that should be allowed. I think that's not a bad thing. There's a lot of fan artists whose work I love and I've bought their artwork. But I just think it's a really weird double standard that something that's written isn't allowed to be sold and profited off of, even on something like Etsy, but something that's drawn, especially for like a cartoon series, when if you're a good enough artist, your drawings can look like they came from the actual show, is allowed to be sold and is allowed to be profited off of. And I've had a lot of contentious arguments over the years with different fan artists, some of whom have disagreed with my stance and feel that fan art is a completely different medium and therefore it should be allowed and fan fiction absolutely shouldn't because history, I guess. And look, I'm not going to argue that this is the current rule and that that is just the world we live in when it comes to copyright. What I am going to argue is that I think it's complete bullshit and copyright laws are bullshit. They're just harming, as I said, smaller creators like myself. And look, even all of that aside, in a way, I kind of think the fact that fanfiction can't be monetized and is kind of the ultimate example of unmonetizable content does make the people who do this work and put so much time and effort into fanfiction in general that much more fascinating, because it's really people who are doing it purely for the love of the craft. It is people who are doing this purely for the love of it, because it is as non-profit as it is possible for something to get. I'm not gonna lie, fanfiction has absolutely made me a better author. It's made me a more confident author. It's allowed me to read more than I ever otherwise would have. I'm a pretty picky reader in general. One of the things I like about fanfiction is that if there are characters that I already like, I'm more tempted to read more stories about these characters, regardless of whether or not it has anything to do with the original property itself. In fact, as I said before, that Glee fanfiction that I've been thinking about since 2011 has nothing to do with the original franchise. It's a fae-fic. And the thing is, prior to my sharing fanfiction for the first time, I had already been writing original fiction for well over a decade, but it wasn't something that I really shared, save for a brief foray of sharing my original work with a HarperCollins owned website called Autonomy. And this one time in the 8th grade when an author came to my school and we got to read our work to them, and they really seemed to like it. By the way, don't let people tell you that anything on the internet is necessarily never gone, because I put up a whole ass book on that Autonomy website, and HarperCollins sure did scrub the existence of it off the face of the goddamn planet. I tried to do a deep dive into the Wayback Machine to see if I could find any of the comments from that era. I think it was like 2011, 2012, and no dice. So like all of this love I got on this story is just kind of lost to time now. I feel like I may have some of those comments screenshotted on a hard drive somewhere, but I couldn't tell you where they are. And honestly, that's why I tend to screenshot some of my favorite comments that I get on my fanfiction now, because while I don't necessarily think that Archive of Our Own is going anywhere, in the off chance that I decide to leave the platform, I'd like to still be able to see the many comments that have given me the confidence to share my work and share my original work too. Getting regular comments on my fanfiction, and for that matter, a regular readership on my work, gave me a confidence that I don't know that I otherwise would have had. In fact, the viewership that I got on all of my fanfiction from 2018 to 2020 gave me the confidence to share my first original novel in 2020 on Wattpad, The Secret Life of Damien Carmichael. You can also find that in the link in the description. Which, by the way, went on to be featured the next year for Wattpad's Pride campaign and got 70,000 hits in like a matter of 2 weeks. And it's since become a story that still gets attention and still gets love to this day. And honestly, that's part of the reason why I'm sharing Assassin of Witches in much the same fashion. Because I love what I do. But to be honest with you, it's kind of hard to have confidence in your work when this particular story is something that I've been working on for 20 years, and until recently, the only one who's seen it is like my mother and my cats. My cats don't give a shit. And like, look, I know we're not supposed to talk about the hit counts on fanfiction, but the fact that my top rated fanfiction right now sits at 16,000 hits and that my overall hit count is 350,000 is like incredible to me. I never imagined something like that for myself. Of course, that's something I always dreamed, but it's not necessarily something you can predict. And I'll be honest, there have even been fanfictions that have been so well written, they've made me want to be a better writer as a result. In fact, I'm currently rereading one of my favorite Good Omens fanfics, Just Like Heaven, and it's so beautifully written that it makes me want to work to be a better writer, more detailed, more involved. I don't know what I was trying to say with this. Obviously, I would argue that in a lot of ways, I'm probably preaching to the choir. If you're watching this video and if you're subscribed to this channel, you're probably already in fandom spaces. This being a fandom space in and of itself. Welcome, hi, hello, we've been expecting you. Wow, that was a sad little clap. And look, part of my point in making this video is that I do feel like to some degree, and I've been guilty of this myself, is there is this kind of knee-jerk reaction to like distance yourself from fan fiction that would be considered bad, or otherwise to say not all fan fiction is bad, and you know, the not all is always a great argument. But if I may circle back to the opening line of this particular video, the point about art is that sometimes it's not going to be something that everyone can agree on. Not every piece of art is for every person. The reality is that art is subjective. Not everything is going to be for every person. And as much as I know that I do have a great fan base, I know that not everyone is going to like everything that I write. And in fact, some people are specifically not going to like the fandom and the particular pairing that I write for. That said, I do think it can be argued that a fair amount do like what I write and do enjoy the pairing that I write. And I've even seen comments from people who didn't traditionally even ship Radiodust as a pairing, but since reading my work have kind of had a change of heart. And look, I love to hear that. I love to be the gateway drug, as it were, into the radiodust fandom. I certainly found my own, so why shouldn't I be that for someone else? And while I think a lot of times fanfiction is derided as cringe, I also think that to a certain degree, maybe the cringe is the point. Maybe the very fact that people can enjoy something so much and put their entire soul into something so much that they aren't going to see any profit off of is actually a beautiful thing. And maybe that's something that should be celebrated. And look, as I said, not all of it's going to be good to me or you. Not everything that's put on YouTube is good. Not every piece of art is good. Not every film or published book or anything else is necessarily good. I've certainly read my fair share of novels that were published that I thought were kind of trash. And I've certainly seen films that were made by major movie corporations which were kind of terrible. The reality is that fanfiction, like any art, is subjective. In fact, the very nature of even a channel like this is that for all the comments that I've received over the years that my channel should be bigger, the very fact of my subscriber count proves that not everyone agrees with that sentence. And I will say, I want to share a very special thank you to everyone who has liked all of my videos, who watched my last video. I'm really shocked at how well that video performed, and I'm really honored. I've gotten a lot of new subscribers, so thank you all for being here. Thank you all for watching this video and for watching my previous video. Thank you for entertaining a femme, lesbian, trans drag queen. Thank you for entertaining just everything that I do and everything that I enjoy, because that is why I'm here, to create content that people want to see. So yeah, I mean, I guess I do. It's kind of funny because I feel like with video essays, it seems kind of gauche to end it by saying, please subscribe, but also that is kind of the expected ending. So if you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, comment down below, and please subscribe to this channel. You can also become a member of this channel. I do have 2 tiers, and I also have a Patreon, patreon.com/NarcissaDeVille, where you can get special cringe videos that are not available on YouTube. All of it for under $5 a month. I have 3 tiers, all of them under $5 a month. And yeah, so thank you so much for watching this video. And until next time, stay devilish and see you next Tuesday.